Scaffolding. OSHA created the term competent person and qualified person to designate those who can evaluate hazardous conditions in mechanical systems, inspect equipment, and train others to work safely on scaffolds. These terms are used throughout Subdivision L for the scaffolding rules. The competent person must be able to identify and correct hazards encountered with scaffolding work, be trained in the structural integrity of the types of scaffolds being used, have authority to promptly take action on the job site and correct any problems with scaffolding, and they must know Subdivision L requirements for the applicable types of scaffolding that they're using. The competent person determines safe access for erectors and dismantlers. They inspect the scaffolding before each shift. They supervise the erection and dismantling they train erectors and dismantlers. They ensure fall protection is provided if greater than 10 feet. They evaluate weather conditions and evaluate parts made by different manufacturers to be sure that they can be used in conjunction with each other if the scaffolding happens to have different manufacturers. And they evaluate the significant deterioration in components to ensure that it is structurally sound and that anything that is worn or damaged is replaced properly. The qualified person, on the other hand, is someone who's recognized by a specific degree or certification. Or it could be somebody that has extensive knowledge and training and experience. But the key is they have to have the ability to solve problems related to the project. Qualified person doesn't necessarily have to be a registered professional engineer, but scaffolds must be designed by a qualified person and must be constructed and loaded according to that design. So a qualified person has to be able to work all of the statics and strengths and be able to design the project so that it's going to be safe for not only the erectors but also the people that will be using it. Fall protection must be provided anytime you're working on scaffolding at greater than 10 feet above the level. Fall protection can come in the form of either guardrails or personal fall protection. If you're using guardrails, you must have a top rail, a mid rail, and you must have toe plate. The top rail must be between 38 and 45 inches from the platform. Now, cross bracing is used on scaffolding to provide structural stability for the platform, and cross bracing can be used instead of a top rail or for a top rail if the crossing point is between 38 and 48 inches from the platform. Now, cross bracing can be used as the top rail or the mid rail, but not for both. Mid rails are to be approximately midway between the top rail and the platform. If you're going to use cross bracing as the mid rail and not the top rail, it must be between 20 and 30 inches from the platform. Toe boards must not have more than a 1/4 inch gap between the toe board and the platform, and they must be 4 inches high. Scaffolding must be capable of supporting its own weight and at least 4 times the maximum load applied. So when you're deciding what type of scaffolding, you need to take into account how many people are going to be on it, what materials are going to be up there with them. You need to know these things so that after the scaffolding is set up, your workers don't overload it by putting too many bricks or too much mortar or too many equipment, things like that up on the scaffolding. The spacing between the planks and uprights can't be more than 1 inch. So when your planks are laid down, you can't have more than 1 inch gap between them. And when your uprights are standing up, you can't have more than 1 inch gap between your uprights. This thing's got to be up tight and close together. When you're working on scaffolding less than 18 inches wide, it does not matter what height you're at, you must have personal fall protection or guardrails, one or the other. When you're setting the scaffolding up against a building, usually you're going to be doing the work on the building itself. You can't be more than 14 inches away from the building. If you are, then you must have guardrails on the side where you're going to be working, or you must use personal fall arrest systems, as in lanyards and personal fall protection. There is an exemption to that, and that is the stucco exemption. If you're actually doing stucco work, you can be 18 inches from your working surface, but no more. The minimum plank overlap is 6 inches, unless you're cleated and secured. The maximum overlap, if the board is 10 feet long, is 12 inches. If the board is longer than 10 feet long, you can overlap up to 18 inches. So remember, you get a minimum of 6 inch and a maximum of 12 inch if your boards are 10 feet or less. If they're greater than 10 feet, you can overlap by 18. So it's either 6 to 10 or 6 to 18 is your range you have to be in, depending on the length of your board. You got to restrain scaffolding from tipping. Basically, once you get 4 times higher than the width, you got to tie it into the building. For example, if your scaffolding is 4 feet wide, when you get to a height of 16 feet, you've got to tie it in. Once you tie it in the first time, if the scaffolding is 3 feet wide or less, once you tie it in the first time, you must tie it in every 20 feet after that. If your scaffolding is wider than 3 feet, after you tie it in the first time, you have to tie it in every 26 feet after that. And as you go down the length of the scaffolding, once you have to start tying it in, it must be tied in at least every 30 feet. So if you had a 90-foot section, you would have 3 tie-ins, one on each end, and then you would come into the middle, have one at 30 feet and another one at 60 feet. You probably have 4 actually. Ladders. When hook-on or attachable ladders are used on scaffolds, they must have rest platforms every 35 feet. If you're using stairway type ladders, you got to have a rest platform every 12 feet. And if you've got scaffolds that have end frames with the ladders built into them, it's okay to use those for accessing up and down as long as they're level and they're no more than 22 inches apart. What's wrong with this picture? Well, there's several things that jump to mind. I mean, you've got electrical wires to run through here. You're closer than 10 feet to the power. Several areas. I would ask, who designed this? Who's the qualified person that made the calculations to determine that this thing is structurally sound? There are areas where you don't have any toe boards or mid rails or top rails. It's pretty unsafe, actually. I mean, it's kind of a fall waiting to happen. What's wrong with this? Several things. You got more than 1 inch gap between your planks. You've got no toe boards here either. What's wrong with this? Well, there's no toe board. But the overlap looks pretty good. It looks to me like they're overlapped right at 12 inches. What's wrong here? Well, pretty much everything. No mid rails, no toe boards. It's overloaded, obviously. Looks to me like the whole thing's just going to collapse. If somebody walked across there, it would be the straw that broke the camel's back. When you're working on a scaffold, never use a ladder or stand on anything to gain some extra height. If you do, you're negating the impact of that top rail, and if you were to slip and fall, there's a high probability that you would go over the edge. Always use the correct type of ladder. It's very common for people to be injured trying to access scaffolding and they're not using the proper kind of ladder. So only use ladders that are designed for the type of scaffolding you're working on. Here's an example where the ladder is integrated into the side rails of the scaffolding or side frames. This would be fine to use for access. Remember when your people are erecting or dismantling scaffolds that they use personal fall protection. Looking at this right here, I can't tell, but it does not appear to me that he is tied in anywhere. He's got on a harness, but what's he tied into? Foundations are critical. It's the most critical part of setting up a scaffolding is getting everything level and plumb. You must make sure you have a good mud sill. You got to be sure your base plates are nailed to the mud sill. That's code. And you got to make sure that you're good and level. This is an example of an unacceptable foundation. You can't just go stack up some concrete, broken concrete blocks, or any kind of concrete blocks for that matter, stick a mud sill on it, and then level it best you can with the leveling screws. That's an unstable foundation. You should never do this. Don't wrap or enclose your scaffolding. Scaffolds are made to accept forces in the vertical direction, up and down. They're very strong that way. When you wrap them, and the wind blows, tremendous horizontal forces can be applied to the scaffolding, and it can rip it and pull it down. There have been some horrendous accidents where scaffolding was wrapped with plastic. Workers were working, it was cold, the wind was blowing, and somebody had the idea that they would get some plastic and duct tape it and tie it into the scaffolding, and they enclosed it, and the wind just blew it and pulled the whole thing down. When you're tying into the building, it's important to do this right. You can't just tie it in with wire. You have to find a good anchor point. You have to brace it and pull it up. So the brace has to be something like a wooden block that's cut specifically for this, so that the scaffolding, as the wind blows and people walk on it, that wire is not constantly flexing. If you just tied it in, you didn't use a wood block to brace it, to pull it up tight, all of that flexing on the wire would greatly weaken the wire, and eventually it could break and provide no protection at all. Often wire is the only method you've got for tying something in. There are a lot of variables when you're wiring in, using wires to secure your scaffolding. You got to make sure that the wire is good and that it's been inspected by a competent person. What's wrong with this? Well, to start with, he's got on a personal fall arrest system, he's got a lanyard, but look what he's tied to. That rope is several feet below him. If he were to fall, I'm not sure that he wouldn't hit the ground before his lanyard deployed. And even if it did, that extra 3 or 4 feet he would be falling would apply tremendous forces to him, probably injure him. And that extra force would also possibly just rip whatever it's anchored to off the anchor point. The farther you fall, the more force that's going to be applied to not only the person but the anchor point. So it's very important, if you're using personal fall arrest, that you keep yourself at a point to where you're not going to fall more than the 6 feet before your lanyard deploys to slow you down and prevent you from hitting the ground. What's wrong here? Well, obviously, he's got no personal fall arrest system. He's got no guardrails, no toe plates. This is pretty much a very, very serious OSHA violation. And the individual has put himself at great risk of a fatality. What's wrong with this one? Well, first of all, there are no guardrails on the ends of the side frames of the scaffolding. So you have no top mid rail. You got no toe kicks. It's pretty unsafe. What's wrong here? Well, they've used cross bracing as a top rail. So there's no mid rail and there's no toe plates. Remember the big hazards, okay? Electrical is a huge hazard dealing with scaffolds. You can't be within 10 feet of any type of electrical source. Guardrails or personal fall arrest systems are required anytime you're working more than 10 feet above the ground. You got to protect people below. Use your toe kicks, toe boards. Make sure your access walkways, platforms, all that are secure and they have the proper overhang and you have good proper access areas. Do not overload your systems. You must be very careful with this. It's easy to do. You design it to put so many bricks up there or so many rocks or whatever it is you're doing, and it's not communicated to your workers, and all of a sudden somebody sets something up there and they're way overloaded. Be sure everything is level and plumb. That's critical in setting up scaffolding. Be sure you tie in properly. Don't use windscreens, and don't use damaged components. This is a serious problem here. I mean, the people set this scaffolding up all around this electrical. It's a miracle to me that somebody wasn't killed in setting it up, to be honest with you. But worse than that, you're going to have workers up there probably walking around completely and totally unaware that they've got electrical stuff right under their feet, and it wouldn't take much to potentially shock somebody here. Keep in mind, the scaffolding is touching the ground. It's made from metal. So if you were to be touching the scaffolding and touch those wires, or even get close to those wires, you could become part of the circuit. There are a lot of things that are not written into the OSHA regulations. They've not been revised in a while. Best practice is to always tag scaffolding while it's being dismantled or erected, because often these projects go through break periods, lunch. If you leave it and it's not tagged, somebody else could come along. I've seen situations where people were erecting scaffolds and they went to lunch or went home for the day, and they came back and found other workers on the scaffolding doing work from other trades, other subcontractors on the project. They needed to do something, and they thought that they would just go ahead and jump up there and get it done while your crew was gone. So if you're in the process of assembling or disassembling the scaffolding, tag it. It's not safe for use. And along the same lines, once it has been inspected and it's ready to use, tag it with something green that says inspected, ready for use. This gives all your people a very clear direction on which scaffolding systems have been inspected or ready for use, and which ones are in the process of being either dismantled or erected. In summary, scaffolds must be inspected by a competent person, each shift actually. And scaffolds may only be erected by people who have been trained by a competent person, and that competent person is somebody who has extensive knowledge and experience in scaffolding. Scaffolds may only be designed by a qualified person. And you must provide fall protection when working on scaffolding at a height of greater than 10 feet. And remember, scaffolding has a lot of very specific numeric specifications. Use reference guides when setting it up and inspecting it to make sure you don't miss anything. If you should have any questions or need any additional training for scaffolding or fall protection, contact Applied Risk Solutions. We'll be more than happy to help you with your scaffolding projects.